So with the announcement of the CRF300L from Honda, it's got a lot of people asking, will the WR250R from Yamaha remain the king of the lightweight, small displacement dual sport? I'm going to do a keyboard comparison, as obviously I can't test ride the 300 yet, but I'll do the best I can with what I've got, which is kind of the theme of 2020 anyway. Also, if you've got the attention span of a cocaine-addled squirrel, I have put timestamps down below to help you through this painful process. For the rest of us, let's enjoy some discussion on both of these bikes so that maybe I can help you in making a decision for your next dual sport motorcycle. So let's roll that intro and get into it. So let's talk about the WR250R and what makes it great. I'm going to try and keep this brief as there's so much information about why these are fantastic bikes now. But basically we've got a over-engineered frame, which is absolutely fantastic. It's lightweight, aluminium. It's really the secret to its performance off-road. Then couple that with great suspension that is much better than the competition in the small displacement dual sport market. It's fully adjustable. The only fault I would say of the suspension is the rebound dampening on the rear shock, which can be fixed when you're going to get the suspension tweaked to your desire anyway, so it's not too big of a deal. Then we've got that fantastic little motor. Not only is it dead reliable, but it's also quite good performance from the little 250. Now, problem with that performance is it's all up top of the rev range, so you really do have to wring the neck out of the WR250R to get the best out of it, but that is an absolute blast to do, keeping this little thing on the boil and ripping through the bush. So it's a lot of fun, but if you're the guy that likes low-end torquey kind of performance, this isn't the bike for you, so be warned. That's one of the major factors that you should keep in the back of your head when considering these two bikes. The other great thing about this bike is the wet weight. It only comes in at 134, maybe 135 kilos wet, which is extremely light. You can pick this bike up all day, every day by yourself without any help. So that is a major factor in my decision making when I purchased the bike myself, along with all those other things I mentioned. It's also got a really big alternator for a 250, so it can power a lot of electronics, which is another plus, as well as a decent subframe for carrying luggage, and most importantly, it has a 6-speed gearbox, which is fantastic for riding off-road, but still being able to hold highway speeds. Although I will put it out here, if you're a bigger bloke, I'm not really a bigger bloke, but I'm big enough that when I'm on the bike and my luggage is on the bike and you're riding in heavy winds, you will need to change the gear ratios. I did that anyway because I wanted better performance in low speed scenarios. You will need to bring the gearing down a bit so that it can hold higher speeds when you're doing long distance touring, but that's no big problem. That's a $20 fix. So there's a lot of fantastic things that come together. We've got great frame, great suspension, gem of an engine, lightweight, and a 6-speed gearbox. Most of the components of a unicorn motorcycle. The one thing that kind of leaves it out of the conversation a bit is the fact that that 250 just doesn't quite have enough low-end grunt to get it into the ultimate unicorn conversation. It was my unicorn for a very long time, and it still is for a lot of people, as it has so many perfect aspects. Putting up with an engine that doesn't have quite as much low-end torque as you would like is an easy thing to do, especially when you got the pipe, the fuel programmer, lower the gearing. You almost don't notice it when you're off-road, but it is there, and it is a reason why some people don't pick this bike up. So I wanted to put that out there, that's pretty much the main reason why people will move past the WR, as well as the price. Obviously all those great features cost money and cost engineering, so they're not cheap. Here in Australia they're $9,600 right away. It is a great bike if you can afford it. So let's compare it to the CRF300L. It doesn't have quite as good a suspension, at least from the spec sheets. It looks like it keeps relatively the same suspension as the 250L, although it does gain some ground clearance and some travel. So that is good news. You have more travel and you're able to clear obstacles better. but it isn't as adjustable as the WR and therefore not as tunable. So that's a definite point to the WR250R. Of course, you can just throw the suspension in the bin and put all new suspension on it, but that is going to cost you a pretty penny, but it is something that can be done, or heavily modifying the suspension you've got. You've always got to consider this in the scenario. You can get the bike that's kitted out with all the great components already, or you could take an engine and a frame that you quite like, but it might be cheaper, and modify the crap out of it, and at the end of the day they end up at the same price. It's all about strategizing which way you want to get to the end result. So I think the 300cc motor is why this is coming into the conversation, as comparing it to the WR250R as that perfect small dual sport. The torque is actually more, which is the important part. It's got 2 foot-pounds, or about 3 Newton meters more of torque. It's about 26.6 Newton meters or 19 point something foot-pounds of torque. I'll put it up on the screen somewhere, but it is a little bit more, and it also makes its horsepower and that torque lower in the rev range, and it also has a lower compression. So that bigger capacity, the performance coming lower in the rev range, all lends itself to being a little more torquier and that bit more tractor factor down low. So the people who've been looking for an engine that has a little more torque down low compared to the WR, I think this is going to be the bike for you. And it's one of the reasons I'm really interested in this bike. If it can offer just that little bit more than the WR down low without feeling too sluggish because of its extra weight, I will be very interested in this bike. So that's the other big deal with this bike. It has lost a lot of weight compared to the 250L, about 4 kilos over the outgoing 250L. So that's quite a significant weight savings, but that's still quite a sizable weight difference compared to the WR250R. It's about 7 kilos or so. Whether you will actually feel that is the big question we all have. Now, when I rode the 250L, which is even heavier than the 300, I actually couldn't notice that weight differential. It might be because the 250L has a lower ground clearance and a lower center of gravity than the WR250R. So when you were picking up the bike, it did show itself a bit. I would notice the weight when picking up the 250L out of the dirt compared to the WR250R. So that was the only time I noticed the weight, but it certainly wasn't enough for me to be like, oh, this is just unmanageable. I think they're both in that category of light enough to be picked up repetitively outdoors in a hot environment without too much trouble. So they both get a tick in weight, but the WR250R is still significantly lighter. Whether that will factor into rider experience really noticing that or not is a question to have. But if lightweight is an absolute must, then the WR250R obviously wins the points here. Another thing that the CRF300L has over the WR is a little bit of modern touches. It looks more up to date. It has LED lights all around. The WR250R, the only LED lights it has are on the rear. But it's nice to see that the 300L has a bit of a modern look. It looks a lot fresher than the WR. The WR does look like an old era dual sport. The other thing that it has, which is controversial and is mandatory here in Australia for anything over 250cc's, is ABS. Myself, for an off-road bike, I don't want ABS on there. I know some of you guys might jump on here and argue, oh, you need ABS for off-road. If you're saying that you really don't ride off-road enough, or ride off-road in really rough situations, you need to be able to lock up your wheels off-road in a lot of situations, and ABS doesn't allow you to do that effectively. It is switchable, so as long as it's easy to switch on and off, as long as they keep the same system as the Rally, it was just one button, you didn't have to flick through any menus or anything, you just hit the button, hold it down for a while, and it turns off. It is livable, but I really can see the situation where you're riding in a tough situation off-road, you're getting hot and bothered, you've dropped it for the 4th or 5th time and your mates are getting sick of picking you up and you just want to get over the next obstacle. You might forget to hit that ABS problem. Well, then you're going to come into problems, but it is something you can live with. And it is also heavily outweighed by the benefits you get on-road. On an on-road bike, I always want ABS. I am humble enough to admit that ABS is far superior at braking a bike on the road than I would be without that ABS, especially in a panic situation with new riders where you might just grab a fistful of brakes. It is a very, very great safety feature to have. It is a win-lose situation. You win on the road, it is much safer with the ABS over the WR250R. You got to ask yourself, where is your weakness? Are you a not so confident rider on road and you're new to the whole motorcycle world? Or are you an old vet and you feel very comfortable at handling a bike on road situations? That's a question you got to ask yourself. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the frame here. It's come out that the 300L has a complete one-piece frame. If you load up the rear and hypothetically you put too much on and you break the frame, you're likely going to need a whole new frame rather than it being fixed. So that could be a problem. The amount of people that might actually end up doing that is probably going to be quite small. Honda are usually pretty good with their quality control. They're not perfect, but they're usually pretty good. And if there are problems, you can probably bet that they will come to the rescue and update that and do a recall on it. But it is something to be aware of. I think the WR250R will have the better and stronger subframe purely because it isn't a one-piece setup like the CRF300L. If I was looking at both these bikes, it would be something in the back of my mind, but it wouldn't stop me from getting the 300L if I really wanted it. But I thought I'd point that out as it is a significant difference between the two bikes. The CRF300L also has a 6-speed gearbox, so I think that's fairly simple comparison. The other points that I think go to the WR250R, which aren't necessarily because of the WR250R, it's just about the recency of the 300L, is the accessory market. You can get absolutely anything you want for the WR250R. Obviously with the 300L coming out, it's coming here in March, so there's not really going to be anything accessory wise for quite some time, so that's something to think about. Price is also going to be a key factor. I am willing to bet that the 300L will still be significantly cheaper than the current WR250R. The final thing I wanted to point out is the 300L has significant changes over the 250. So the motor's different. Yes, it's existed in the CB series for a while, but that frame is pretty much all new as well, at least heavily redesigned. So there's a lot of new components on this. So that means that there's things that Honda haven't tested long term to see if they will hold up and hold the distance. We know that the WR is just about indestructible. It's basically reached the status of the DR and the DRZ of being a cockroach of the motorcycle road. You can't kill the things, they just go forever and they're very reliable. The jury is still out in some respects with the 300L. We've got a lot of history to say that it will be fantastic. The 250L is fantastic and very reliable. So are the CB300 series from Honda. So it would make sense that this 300L and the Rally as well will be very reliable, durable motorcycles, but there still is that question mark out there. So if you do jump in straight away, you're going to be one of those people that's going to have to find out for yourself whether Honda have brought everything together to work as well in the 300 as it did on the 250L. So that's something to keep in mind as well. The WR250R is a known quantity. The 300L is a little bit unknown at this point in time. Another thing to discuss is really not related to the bike specifically, and I brought this up when I was comparing the KLX 300 with the CRF 300L. And you really need to think about dealer support, whether you have a good relationship with the dealer, how close the dealer is to you, insurance costs, all those kind of things. What do your buddies ride? What do they know? What kind of situation you're riding in? Some countries you might even not be able to get the bike that you actually want. So you need to figure all the scenarios outside of the bike that make the ownership experience better. Parts availability and the support for the bike is another thing to consider. I had this experience a bit with my Harley Davidson. Now there are parts everywhere for this bike. There's so many different mods, particularly for the Sportster. But being in Australia, it is a little hard to get a lot of those parts without a big postage cost. So that's something I didn't consider. If you're in a country where it's very easy to get Yamaha parts, but it's difficult to get Honda parts or vice versa, that might be the thing that tips the scale as well. So keep that in mind. But let's talk about who I think each bike will suit. I think the WR250R is still the king of the almost enduro, the soft enduro motorcycle. If you're the guy that you're pretty much doing exclusively off-road, you're doing single track most of the time, but you do want a bike that can still do multi-day trips, but most of your riding is with guys on KTMs and beaters, then the WR250R is going to have the edge. It's lighter weight, better suspended, has a frame that can cope with it much better. So if you're, again, a harder rider, you can ride an EXC, but you don't want the service intervals and you want to do some long distance touring as well every now and then, go the Yamaha. If you've got a lot of road riding, you're doing a lot of commuting and as well as off-road, then the CRF really does offer the advantage because of that ABS. That is a lifesaver on the road. So I think if you're doing a lot of road riding or you're a new rider, I think the CRF300L is going to be the safer way to go. The other thing that the CRF300L will offer is to the guy that wants a little more torque than most 250s can offer. If it's just not quite enough, it doesn't get your juices going with the 250L, the KLX or the WR, then the 300L might just offer enough torque to get you over the line, and with those modern features that you just can't get on a DRZ, like the 6-speed gearbox, the modern looks, that kind of thing, and the ABS. So those are some reasons where I can see the CRF300L going, and I do think it's a legitimate comparison for a lot of people that the 300L might end up being the better bike, considering that bigger displacement engine, that addition to the lighter frame and the fresher, more modern look with that ABS gives you a lot of reasons to think hard about the 300L. But I still think the WR is king straight off the showroom floor for that soft enduro situation. I'm really looking forward to getting a ride on this bike in March. I also think it might poach a few of the DRZ 400 owners as well. That's another conversation and another rant. So thanks for sticking with me to the end. Don't forget to hit that like button. And until next time, guys, stay shiny side up, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch you later.